Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if it's the first time you've come across one of my videos. I wanted to film today my son's birth story. I have been talking about it a little bit in my vlogs that I wanted to tell a little bit about his story and how he became a medically complex baby. Before I do that though, I do want to make some very important disclaimers. So number one, I do not blame the medical staff that took care of me when I delivered my son or while I was pregnant. I don't blame them. What happened to my son was going to happen regardless. So I want to get that one very clear. And the second one that I want to make extraordinarily clear is just because this happened to me does not mean it's going to happen to you. And if you recognize some of the things that I'm talking about here as something that was familiar to you, or that you think it might be something similar that's what's affecting your baby, or you have any concerns whatsoever, please do not take what I am saying as gospel, and please go and seek your own doctor's advice. Take your baby to a pediatrician or to your general practitioner and talk to them about your concerns. Just because it happened to us does not mean it's happening to you. But I wanted to share my son's birth story for several reasons. So number one, as a coping mechanism for me, and as a way to find a community of mums and families who go through having medically complex babies. It is really, really, really tough. It's also very isolating. I am one of those people, and I am supremely lucky to say that I have not only a village but a city that surrounds us, and they take very good care of us, but they're not here on the daily basis. They can't be. They have their own lives to live. So I don't have those people around me all the time. And because my partner has to go out and work, I'm here taking care of my son 100% of the time. And it can be extraordinarily isolating. And it's one of the reasons that I decided to kick back up my social media and share our story and share my struggles and share my thoughts and share everything that we're going through. Yes. Because I think it's so important to share that motherhood is not glamorous all the time. And I would never take back anything that happened, in the sense that it was our journey and it had to happen for me to get my son, and I do not regret having my son at all. I need to make that very clear. I don't regret having him at all, but this version of motherhood is extremely different to the version of motherhood that I got with my daughter. And I think it's really important, and I've seen it even posting on my TikTok, some of the vile comments that I get every now and again, where people are very, very, very judgy when they haven't walked a centimeter in your shoes, and they have absolutely no idea what it is that you're going through, or they don't even understand what it is that you're actually saying. So please keep that in mind while watching this video. If you have any questions or you want me to clarify anything, please leave a comment, but I'm just going to jump straight into it. So my pregnancy with my son, actually my pregnancy with both of my children, was not fun. I am not one of those women who were very lucky who enjoy pregnancy. I just don't like it. My hypertension got worse. So I have existing hypertension, and it got worse while I was pregnant, which wasn't very surprising to me at all. I also got gestational diabetes with both of my pregnancies, and I was insulin managed for that. So just a very quick little medical background there. The first half of my pregnancy with my son was fine. I was not very sick. I didn't get a lot of morning sickness. I was just a little bit nauseous. But all in all, I had plenty of energy and I actually felt pretty good. And we were going pretty well up until the second trimester. Excuse me. I'm telling your story. Do you mind? Sorry, my son is just playing on the floor next to me. So, yeah, we were going very, very well up until the second trimester. And it was more the second half of the second trimester. So we're talking around that sort of 24-ish weeks. And that's when things sort of started to go downhill for us. And by that, I mean, we were up at the hospital very regularly having checks because I wasn't feeling him move very much. At first, this didn't really worry me that much because I had a very similar thing with my daughter. So she was actually induced early because I didn't feel a lot of her movements, and they were just getting progressively more worried, and we erred on the side of caution, and I was induced with her. So with my son, I wasn't all that surprised when I started to feel less movement. However, if you've ever been pregnant before, you know that ice cold chill that goes down your spine when you realize you haven't felt your baby move for most of the day, and you just get really, really scared because you know those stories, you know how they end, and you just don't want that to be your reality. So we were up at the hospital really frequently from about 24, 25 weeks on because I did not feel him very much at all. I had a normal placenta, as in the placement. I can't remember what it's called, if it's anterior or posterior, but like the normal placement. So there's one of them where, depending on where the placenta is, you may not feel the baby very much. I didn't have that. So there was no reason for me not to feel him very much. I just did not feel him moving. I just did not feel him moving very much at all. So then we kind of transition into the third trimester, and we, like I said, we're up at the hospital frequently. I was already a high risk pregnancy, so I was very familiar with all of the doctors up there, and we were kind of like frequent flyers. And it was really at around 35 weeks that things started to get a little bit more hairy. Now, I want to say I'd never had any bleeding. I never had severe pain or anything like that. But at 35 weeks, again, I was up at the hospital getting a routine CTG for us. So where they put the monitors on to monitor the baby, because I wasn't feeling him. And they were very concerned that he was not doing what they wanted to see on the monitors. So they filled me with fluid and they had me on an IV, and it took 5 hours for them to finally decide that I can come off the CTG. And in that time, they had come in and spoken to me about my son's birthday. So they were basically talking at 35 weeks to take him out because he was not doing what they wanted to see. At the time, I remember thinking like, yeah, okay, it's go time. Like, this feels right. Let's do it. Like, let's get him out, because I'm starting to get really nervous. Then with our healthcare system, they have like a tiered thing where a doctor makes a decision, they have a feeling that they want to go ahead with something, and then they have to use a consult, and the consult can either agree or the consult can say no, and then basically that stops everything. In my case, the consult said, even though he looked at all of the CTGs previously and he looked at my concerns and he came and spoke to me, he said that he did not think it was necessary to take my son at that time, and they wanted to let him cook a little bit more. Now, to be fair, I also completely understood this argument, because the longer the baby is in there, the better it is for them. And obviously, I didn't want to have to deal with the NICU, and I didn't want to have to deal with those associated risks if we didn't have to. So as a unit, we decided that it was okay to leave him in there, because he was his heart was beating and he was moving, just very minimally. They decided that it was better, and their medical recommendation was to leave him in. So we went ahead with that. I did get a little bit frustrated because initially I was told that we would then kind of limp towards 36 weeks and then have another evaluation to see how we were traveling. And if things were still going well, then we might limp to 37 and it would be an induction at 37 weeks. So basically that whole time I was up at the hospital basically every 2 days saying I can't feel him very much. I just have a sinking feeling, and it's really starting to affect my mental health. So we hobbled to 37 weeks where I was told I would then have a medical induction because I still couldn't feel him. They were doing ultrasounds quite frequently on him just to check the blood flow and things like that. And most of the time that was coming back normal. So we kind of hobbled along to 37 weeks. Then when I got to 37 weeks, I saw a doctor who I'd never seen before, and they had come in and basically said, I don't know why anyone's talking about taking your baby out this week. We're going to leave you until 40 weeks. Now, I know for most people who have healthy pregnancies with no concerns, 40 weeks is the ultimate goal. But for me, it was not the ultimate goal, mainly because I was getting so anxious and I was just starting to get a really bad feeling in my gut that something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, and it was one of those things that I was starting to get very caught up in my head that we were going to have one of those tragic outcomes and that we were going to lose my baby. So I spoke to a different doctor and basically laid all of that out the next time I was in the women's assessment unit, and just sort of said, look, I understand that you guys want the baby to stay in as long as possible. So do I. But at this point, I'm up here almost every day because I cannot feel him move. I don't feel any movement. There's no reason I can't feel any movement. And then when you put me on the ultrasound, your own techs are saying that technically he is moving, but he is not moving with the amount or the strength that we would expect for a 37-week baby. So even they are admitting that his movements are weak because they couldn't feel it through my tummy. And when they were watching me with the ultrasound probe, they would be watching the ultrasound probe for 10, 15 minutes before they would even see much of a movement. So I kind of said to them, this is really not helping my mental health. This is really starting to stress me out. I already have a baby at home, like a toddler, and it was really starting to take a lot of time, me being up in the hospital so frequently. So we decided that right at 38 weeks, I would be induced. So I went into the hospital and I had an examination, and they said that I was 2 centimeters dilated. And because with my daughter, I was induced, and I was induced fast. Her delivery was really, really fast. So when I was induced with her, my stage 1 was 4 hours, stage 2 was 12 minutes, and stage 3 was 12 minutes. So my daughter shot out like a baseball. So pretty much everybody was expecting that my son would come pretty much the same way. So when I heard I was 2 centimeters dilated, I thought, brilliant, like my body is ready for this. We are going to get him out safely, and it's going to be over, you know, like I'm going to know he's here, and we're just going to deal with what we've got to deal with, because I still had a really bad feeling. And I'm one of those people that I trust my bad feelings. Every time I have one of these bad feelings, something goes wrong. It may not necessarily be with me. It will just be someone I'm very close to, but something will go wrong. So I was really anxious, and I just wanted to get him out and to have him earthside and know if he was okay, and if he wasn't okay, to get the next process rolling. Sorry, he's blowing bubbles at a cow. So when I went in that morning to be induced, I was feeling confident in the sense that I knew my body could handle it. I'd done it before. I also, because my daughter's one was so fast, I did it with no pain meds. So I was kind of walking in thinking that I knew what I was expecting. So I walked in there and they hooked me up. Now, I don't have my medical notes in front of me, but I'm fairly sure that the drug they used was Pitocin. It came through a drip. I may have that wrong, but I'm pretty sure that was the drug name. So they started me up on that. They did the examinations, got me hooked up, and we progressed. We started going. So essentially, labor did not go to plan. So what happened was I was laboring for several hours where my contractions were getting increasingly strong, but I was not dilating. And when they were monitoring my son, they noticed that his heart rate was dropping every single time I had a contraction. So obviously there's multiple dangers there. And so they told me that they wanted to put a probe on his head to be able to more accurately see what was going on with him. So I agreed to that. And so we just kept pushing for about 7 hours, where they would increase the Pitocin, they would monitor my contractions, they would check my dilation and see kind of where the big picture was. And basically it ended up being that I was still 2 centimeters dilated. The contractions were the equivalent of someone who was around 8-9 centimeters dilated. So they were pretty intense, but every single time I had a contraction, my son's heart rate would basically halve. So his heart rate would sit around the 140, 160. And when I got a contraction, he would drop down into the 70s, 80s, 60s. Like, it was quite scary. And obviously I'm one of those people who, I've been around medical people enough that I start to watch the small nuances of movements that they do. And for us, I had a fantastic team of midwives, and one of my midwives was a student midwife. And I noticed that at the beginning, the tone in the room was very jovial, and she was just really excited that I had given permission for her to be with us for the whole journey. So she would see me right through for her shift anyway, which her shift had just started pretty much when I was starting to be induced. That's very distracting. So the chances of her actually being on deck, on duty, whatever, on shift, when I actually delivered my son was pretty good, considering my history of how my first baby went. So normally the way you respond to the first induction is a pretty good indicator, not like concrete, but it can be a pretty good indicator for how you're going to respond to the second one. So the mood in the room when she had come in and like everything was sort of happening was really quite happy and relaxed. And, you know, the senior midwife in the room was lovely, and we were all joking and we were all having a really good time. And just as things sort of progressed, I noticed that the senior midwife's tone was changing. When she would evaluate me, she would examine me, and she would look at the monitor for my baby. And not that, like, nothing negative, it was just the jovial tone lessened. And then I noticed that the student midwife was starting to pick up on that as well. And so I was just watching them a little bit more closely. And then it was that dreaded, you know, we need to get a doctor to come in and have a look at this. So I was like, okay, like fine, that's fine. So the doctor came in and had a look at the really long strip of paper that had all of the heart rates on it for the last couple of hours. And they had circled every time I was having a contraction, which coincided with a dip. And so it was one of those things where it was just, again, I watch body language. So I was watching the body language of the doctor, and the doctor was looking at me and she said, look, we're really confused as to why you're no longer dilating, like you haven't moved. And yet your body is trying to progress the labor, but it's not allowing us to go to the next stage of labor. And by this point, it should have. We've kind of maxed out the amount of Pitocin that we can give you at this time. And I was like, okay, so what does that leave us? And so they were like, let's try for another half an hour and we'll see what happens. And I was like, yep, fine, different positions, just to see if that would help my baby's heart rate, like all different things. Like my midwives were doing the load. They were trying everything. So we were doing everything for the next half an hour. And then this doctor came back in and she had a look, and I knew straight away that something was wrong because she whispered something to the midwife, left the room, and came back about 5 minutes later with a consultant in black scrubs. Now, at my hospital, it's usually a pretty good indicator if you have someone who comes in black scrubs that shit's about to hit the fan because they are the high level consultants and they're like, they know their stuff. So this doctor was looking with the original first doctor. They were looking at the long CT strip. They were talking to the midwives, all in a very quiet conversation. And then the original doctor came up to me and she said, you know, Elsa, I need to talk to you about the serious implication that's going on here. We're very concerned about your son and we think we need to do an emergency C-section. And I was like, okay, let's go. Like, go. What's the holdup? And I think because they weren't quite expecting me to be the way I was in that I had already thought of all of this. Like the whole time that they were out of the room, I am already processing this. I knew what was going to happen. I also never walked in there attached to any type of birth plan apart from get him and I through this as safely as possible. So however that had to happen, I didn't care. Okay, sorry, I just put him down for a nap. So anyway, they basically came over and said, like, we're going to do an emergency C-section. And because I had already thought this through, I was like, yep, let's go. And they weren't expecting me to be quite so okay with that. I had walked in there with no care about how this was going to happen, just as long as it happened safely. So they were very confused and kept checking, like, no, Elsa, you understand this means that you won't progress this labor this way. We're going to take you in for a surgery, like it's a C-section. And I was like, I know, where's the scalpel? Where's the theater room? Let's go. And it actually had to take my partner to step in and say, like, trust me, she's not understanding you. She knows perfectly well what you're telling her. She just wants this done. So let's stop with the prattle. Like, you don't need to explain it to her. She understands what you're saying. Let's go. So pretty much within 15 minutes, I was in the theater room getting prepared. And in order to do it, they have to put in a spinal. And so the spinal went wrong in that it took the anesthesiologist a long time to actually put in the spinal, to the point where they almost just said, like, if she can't get it within the next 30 seconds, we're going to have to completely knock you out and do the surgery that way because your son's heart rate is dropping even further. Like, we don't have time. And they had brought in a more experienced anesthesiologist who did it under an ultrasound probe, and they managed to actually get the needle in and like paralyze me and all that sort of stuff that they have to do. So that was fine, and the actual surgery went fine. They got my son out and everything seemed normal in that he didn't cry for a little bit, but he didn't need any sort of extra stimulation, or he definitely didn't need like a NICU to step in, but they were on the outside just waiting to step in if they were needed because of the concerns with his heart drops and stuff like that. So it all kind of took a while. I bled quite a lot and it took them quite a lot of time to actually sew me up. So my partner ended up taking my son out of the theater while they had to stitch me up because he was getting too cold. And then everything seemed perfectly fine until later that night. So my son was born at 8 o'clock and we had gone in at 9:30 that morning. And he was born at 8 p.m. So it had been a long day. And by, I think it was around 3 a.m., so my partner had gone home, and because I was still paralyzed from the drugs, I had my son sleeping in the bassinet next to me. And I remember looking over at him and seeing a lot of foam coming up out of his mouth. And I launched myself as best as I could when my legs weren't working, like rolled myself over to try and pick him up, and I hit the emergency button. And so the nurses came running in, and basically they had said to me that they thought he was having dusky episodes, which is, I'm not 100% sure what the dusky episodes are, but they can be quite common for babies who have had a C-section, because the baby hasn't really, now I could be very wrong, but my understanding of it is because the baby wasn't born the natural way, that their body hasn't had a chance to process the fact that it's now got to breathe on its own and do things on its own. So it can take a little bit of time for their brain to sort of catch up. And so the fact that he was having the dusky episodes wasn't concerning in and of itself. And we were in the hospital for about 5 days. And in that 5-day period, he had 4 episodes. And he never had to get sent down to NICU, but the doctors were watching him quite closely. But everybody was happy for us to go home. So we did. So we went home, and when he was 12 days old, I took him to my GP for the normal meet the baby, and to get him checked over. And in that appointment, I had sort of just casually mentioned to her that his owlet sock, which was the same sock I'd used for my daughter, had been registering every night that he was dropping oxygen. But he wasn't dropping oxygen where it would stay down. He would kind of drop it and it would come back up and then drop and come back up. And he would sort of go into little periods of this. And so I'd mentioned it to my GP, and she also didn't like his colouring because he was a little bit yellow. And my hospital had this program where if the baby was less than 14 days old, you could bring them back to the midwifery ward, and you would be able to see a pediatrician without having to be triaged through the emergency room. So that's what we did. And basically when the pediatrician was having a look at him, she was a little bit concerned, and we went and put him on something called the giraffe bed, which is like their big monitoring bed for babies. So we put him on that, and she had gone away to ring her senior doctor and consult with our concerns. And then the nurse who was with me, so the midwife who had come out to greet me, who was someone who was with us before, shout out to her, she was absolutely phenomenal. She kept me sane for the next part. And she had gone out to ring emergency to basically tell them that she was sending us down, because in order for us to be admitted and like treated, we had to be triaged through emergency. So she was just trying to help us kind of move around and do that. And so nobody else was in the room with me, and my son had another one of these episodes, which we had initially thought were dusky episodes. And basically he went bright red. He was not with me anymore, so he was not focusing on anything. There was like a really vacant stare, and all of his limbs were very stiff. He was bright red, and his heart rate shot up through the roof. It shot, I think, to about like 210. And it was very, very scary and lasted a couple of seconds. And I sort of stuck my head out the door and kind of screamed for help, and everybody came running. And that obviously meant that things moved a lot faster at that point. So we were taken down to emergency and put on a crash bed. So that is one of the big scary rooms where it has all of the machines that go bing and bong, and it means that all of the doctors can come in at a rush, and it's basically a trauma bed. And it's very confronting to see your baby in there, because he was just so small. He was so small, and that room was so big, and there were so many people in there trying to help him. And basically there was a little bit of a tit for tat between the emergency room doctors and the pediatricians in what to do and what the next move should be. And eventually what ended up happening is that my son was stuck in a breathing cycle where he was asleep, but his brain was forgetting to breathe. So he was having apneas. Now, for a baby, apneas are normal. They can be normal, and they are not life-threatening. But what was happening for my son was that he was going into a cycle of dropping his oxygen quite low, and then would come back up, and then drop it, and then come back up, and drop it, and come back up. But he would do this for like a 20-minute, half an hour period. And so it was a constant roller coaster. And so obviously in that time, his physical signs are starting to change, where he's starting to change color. He's starting to pant. You can see he's having real trouble breathing. And it basically ended up with my son having a MET code called on him. So a pediatric MET code, which is a medical emergency and requires all senior doctors to respond. And in our case, I'm sure all doctors and nurses respond to MET codes the same, but I've had MET codes called on me when I was pregnant, and everybody responds quickly and efficiently, but it did feel different when it's a baby. And when you hear pediatric MET code, you see their faces drop, because babies and children can go downhill really fast. And as the mum, it was really traumatic. It was really scary. And before I knew it, there were at least 15 doctors in the room, and it was a big room. It did not feel very big with that happening. And they basically put my son on manual breathing, and they were CPAPing him manually to make sure that oxygen was getting circulated. And remember, at this point, he was 12 days old. So he was about this big, and he had very big adults and humans leaning over him in this very small little bed, getting ready to give him CPR. And it was really scary. It was really, really scary. And so I had one of the senior nurses come in and explain to me that the entire emergency room was frozen, because all of the senior doctors of that emergency room were in that room with us, ready to save my son's life. And in emergency rooms, they can't really function if all the senior doctors are frozen, because they need to give their say-so and opinions and things. So for about 45 minutes in that ER, no one was really moving. And I feel very sorry for those patients that things weren't happening for them in an ER, but that's because all of the senior doctors were there trying to save my son's life. And so whenever I hear someone complaining about the ED, trust me, I've been on that side of it too, where you've had to wait ages, but I flash back to that moment. And so I don't get so frustrated, because the nurses and doctors are trying to do their best. They're trying to save someone else's life, and you have no idea what's going on in the room next to you. And in my case, it was having 15 senior doctors all crowding around my son, all prepared to give him CPR, taking in turns to CPAP him, check him. They were taking bloods. They were, like, he had 2 cannulas in. If you've ever seen a baby with cannulas, I will put in a picture here. It's really sad. It's really sad. And I was sitting there thinking I was about to watch my son die. And it was traumatic. It was really, really traumatic. And I am someone who processes things very differently. I can be very strong on the outside, and on the inside, I am a drowning duck. And so I was just really trying to breathe. And I got told that the NETS department, which is a high-risk neonate or child transport service, was coming in to take my son and I to the children's hospital, because he needed more specialized care. And at the time, they were really concerned that he was septic, and that's not good. That's life-threatening. So we were actually transferred out to a baby ICU, so not NICU, but the ICU for babies in the middle of the city. And it was about 1:30 when they arrived at the emergency department where we were to take us away. And that in and of itself is a really scary experience, because these transport doctors and paramedics are phenomenal. They were really, really good, and they explained things to me, but it's really scary to see your son, who's only so little, be put into, I call it the space capsule. It's a big machine, and basically it's life support for that child. So they plug the baby in, and they set up all of the wires and all of the toses and everything like that, and it breathes for the child. And it has this space capsule, keeps them alive, and it can do an enormous amount of things. I think it had sections to be able to handle dialysis, and like, it's just enormous. Luckily my son didn't need all of those bells and whistles, but he did need some of them. And so we then loaded him up, and it took over an hour to load him in and to be able to make sure he was secured and safe and ready for transport. And then we traveled into the city to go to the children's hospital. So it was about 2:30 when we actually got in there, and we were taken straight in to ICU. My sister met me there, and I've never been so glad to see her because it was really overwhelming. And if you're wondering where my partner was, he had to go home for my daughter because someone had to be with her and the person who was watching her could not stay. So he had to go home with her. So that's why he wasn't with me. But when we went into the children's ICU, if you've never been in there, it's really hard to explain what it's like, because any ICU unit is really sad and a very heavy place to be. It weighs really heavy on your chest. I did not think I was going to cry filming this. Also, if you're wondering, I have spoken to people about this. I have processed it. I have many people and many doctors and lots of people taking care of me too. So trust me, I'm sorting through it. But when you walk into a child's ICU, it's really, really heavy on your soul. Everywhere you look, there is a really sick child or baby. And in our case, he was taken into a very special section of the ICU because they didn't know what was wrong with him. And he had a CPAP machine on, so his whole face was covered. And it was just really hard. It was really scary to see. They had put an NG tube in him to feed, and it was a lot. It was a lot. And the staff there were absolutely incredible. Shout out to them. They were absolutely awesome. And then basically he stayed a couple of days in ICU and they didn't really find anything. What they ended up doing was just saying he had rhinovirus. And so like essentially a really bad cold, but he had no symptoms of having a cold. So whilst I knew that, okay, that may be so, there again, that gut instinct was screaming at me that this is not all. You need to push for more. So he got discharged out of ICU and put up into a normal ward. And when I met the doctors up on that ward, I sort of just said to them that I understand that he has rhinovirus and I accept that. But something was telling me to dig a little deeper and to not let that just be the scapegoat. So I explained to them how his birth had gone, how the late stages of pregnancy had gone, where his lack of movements. And I just said to them, look, can you just humor me and think beyond just rhinovirus? Pretend like that's not a thing. What would you be looking for? And something that I found a little bit helpful for me, and I am not saying that they replace doctors in the slightest, but I used ChatGPT to put in my son's symptoms to see what it would suggest could be potential areas of concern. And as the journey evolved, I kept doing that. I kept updating that chat and it would spit out information to me, or if they gave me information, I would give that to ChatGPT and it would explain it to me in a way that I could understand. So if you're ever in a situation like that, I do highly recommend considering using that technology in that way, obviously with no names and identifying information, but it just had the ability to explain to me in a way that either the doctors couldn't or I didn't want to take up their time to explain it, because I know that they're very busy and they're overworked and there's a lot of things happening. And in the late hours, when I had nothing else to do because sleep was not happening, I could explore what was going on in a way that ChatGPT could help me to do. So these doctors saved my son's life. I have no doubt about that. They listened to me and they recognized my concerns and they acknowledged my concerns, and they did say that they were concerned that the rhinovirus was a red herring and leading them in a different direction that was taking them away from what was actually wrong. So they started doing a whole heap of tests. So we had seen the GP on a Monday and this was a Friday by this point. And it was late on a Friday afternoon. They did an EEG on my son during the day. And it was late that afternoon and he had this absolutely phenomenal nurse. Her name was Brody, and she was just stunning. Oh God, that woman, she held my hand through a lot over the next couple of days. And basically they did an EEG on him, and he was continuing to lose oxygen. And he would go into these patterns again where it would be a 20-minute cycle where he would just, if he's asleep, he would just lose his oxygen and would come back up and then drop and then come back up. And so she, along with her head nurse, had decided to put him on oxygen. And the doctor who was on duty, because it was coming into the end of the day, was a little bit unsure about that. And then the senior pediatrician who I had spoken to about my concerns and who was doing all the tests for me, it was about 5:30, and she came very quickly into the room, and she told me that he was having seizures. So his EEG showed he was having seizures. And at the time, I didn't really know what that meant. I knew what seizures meant for an adult, but I didn't know what that means for a baby, or what's causing it, or if that was the reason his oxygen was dropping. Like, I didn't know. And very, very quickly, they moved to do a heart ultrasound, which luckily came back normal. And then within 48 hours, he had an MRI. When he had the MRI, that showed that my son had had a basal ganglia bleed on the right side, which basically means in the brain, he had had a stroke, which caused a bleed, and that had damaged that part of his brain. And that was hard to hear, but I understood that it made sense. And when I spoke to his now neurology team about it, we were talking, and from the history that I was giving of my pregnancy journey and the delivery, they were thinking that the bleed and the stroke had happened in that time frame. And a few days later, they had a very big meeting with some senior radiologists and senior doctors, and they all looked at my son's file. And based on the images of the bleed, they kind of guessed that the bleed happened when I was around 35 weeks pregnant. So at that time, when he was showing distress on the monitor, is probably when he had this incident. And I don't blame the doctors I had at the time. So when I was pregnant, I don't blame them for not taking him out at the time, because A, we don't know for sure that that's exactly when it happened, but B, it wouldn't have made a difference. So if he had had this brain bleed and this stroke, even if they had taken him out 20 minutes after he had done it, it would not have made any difference. And instead, I would have then probably had a more complex journey in a NICU unit as well. So I don't blame those doctors for that at all. And so we then started thinking, okay, we have a brain bleed baby who's had a stroke, who luckily isn't showing neurological symptoms of this, because it came as a surprise to everybody, because he wasn't showing any symptoms. His only symptom was that he was struggling to have, like, he was having these apneas. That was really the only symptom that he had. And so it was really bizarre, and it kind of took everybody by surprise. And then we just started on this journey of, well, what does this mean? What is that going to look like? And basically that journey was us 6 weeks in hospital, and we got transferred out to a different hospital, not the same one I gave birth at, but a different hospital that is actually a bit closer to us and is in our district. And we ended up meeting his ongoing care team, who is still helping me take care of him now. And basically, it's been a journey. It's been a journey. So at the moment, my son is on, my son has been diagnosed, obviously, with a basal ganglia bleed. And he has also been tentatively diagnosed with epilepsy, because he was still having some seizures, or he's having some suspicious seizure-like activity. So he's on medication for that. He is also still on an NG feed tube. So he has a risky swallow, meaning that he can't control the milk very well, and he has a risk of sending it into his lungs, so aspirating. Luckily, he hasn't done that yet. He just sends it to the airway, but manages to save it before it can drop down too far. So He's on an NG feeding tube for that, and we are working with his team of speech paths to be able to start his solid journey at the moment, but also for him to be able to take bottles a little bit better and safer. So he's on an NG feed for that. He is on oxygen when he's asleep for his sleep apneas. So he has both central and blockage apneas. And more recently, we have started the journey of cerebral palsy assessment. So because he has a brain injury, technically, he is at risk of developing cerebral palsy. And so it was a phrase that had been said to me very early on, and one that I knew I was going to come up against, and one that I had a little bit of time to prepare for. And you can't really prepare for it, unfortunately. So ever since we came out of the hospital in the very end of July, we have been in constant therapies. So he has been seeing a team at like many hospitals. So at the Children's Hospital and our local hospital, and then now the Cerebral Palsy Alliance, who are all rehab teams, and they are all helping him to work on his motor development. So he is behind, and he is sitting at about developmentally about 3 months behind what you would typically think a baby his age would be able to do. So for a 6-month-old, he's actually more like a 3-month-old. And so he's being assessed for his risk of cerebral palsy, and it's a very high risk at the moment because of how he is assessing. So he's being assessed for that. And then we also have concerns around his hearing. So technically at the moment, from what I understand it, his ears are structurally fine. So from the front of the ear and like in the cochlea and stuff, it's fine. The concern has now moved to it being an auditory nerve issue. So basically the pathway that brings the sound to the brain and for the brain to interpret that sound. So essentially my son doesn't respond to noises the way you would expect a baby to. So you can clap really loud in front of him or behind him, so when he can't see you. So if he can see you, it's fine, he'll look at you. But if he can't see you, so if you come up behind him or you shake a toy near his ear and he doesn't see you shaking the toy, he does not react to it. He doesn't blink, he doesn't try to look for the sound, nothing at all. Our dogs can bark, he has no reaction. My 3-year-old can scream when he's asleep, he has no reaction. My 3-year-old can scream when he's like playing on the floor and he doesn't see her, but he doesn't react to her high-pitched squeal. And things like that just, again, don't sit right in your gut, that you know something is not quite right. Especially because I've had a child already. I know how they're supposed to react to loud noises. I know how they're supposed to react to noises in general. And he just doesn't. He doesn't really respond. Even if he's crying and you're trying to talk to him and you're trying to soothe him without touching him, he just doesn't seem to hear you. He doesn't seem to know that you're there until you touch him, especially if he's really worked up and so he's like not looking because his eyes are closed and he's crying. He won't recognize that you're there until you touch him. So my poor little baby has a lot going on. And it's been a really long journey. And it's going to be an even longer one. And it's a really complex and sad journey some days, but I wouldn't change it for the world. He is the happiest little baby. Again, I was not expecting to cry making this video. What a loser. Anyway, he's a really happy little baby. He smiles, he giggles, he loves playing with his sister on the floor, and she gets right down and plays with him, and she knows to avoid all of his cables. So she knows that he doesn't need to be on oxygen if he's not asleep. So she'll, let you know that he's awake. So take him off oxygen. He plays with her on the ground. She gets his toys and she helps me with his rehab programs. So like helping him and encouraging him to stretch up and move his limbs around and try and, free him up a little bit. She helps me to do all of those. Hello, Pascal. She helps me to do all of those. When I've got to put him in the pram outside, she will help me as best as a 3-year-old can. She will help me to do that. Looking at my son, something's wrong, obviously, because he has tapes on his face. He's got 2 tubes. He's got an oxygen and an NG tube. And so you know his life hasn't been easy, but I don't think people really believe the story when I tell it because he still does not look like a brain damaged baby, and that is what he is. It's a really hard thing to say, but that is what he is. He does have brain damage. They did repeat an MRI a few months later, and the MRI showed that the bleed hadn't progressed, which was really good, but that there is dead space there. So there is damage done to that area of the brain. And the basal ganglia is responsible for movement. So it makes sense of his struggles. And the brain is such a sensitive organ that damage here, whilst you anticipate it will damage certain things or affect certain things, whilst it does do that, because all of the parts of the brain are so complex, it's also possible that it can affect an area that you're not expecting. Hence why I won't be surprised if he does have an issue with his hearing and he has issues with swallowing and things like that, because there's movement in that. So the basal ganglia movement, there is movement in that. The brain is so plastic when they're young that we are hoping to essentially retrain his brain to avoid the dead spots and to create new neuro pathways. So he may struggle with movement for a little while, but potentially he could learn with a new neuro pathway and with lots of repetition and therapy and all of this sort of stuff and intervention, that his brain would rebuild that skill. Not rebuild because he never had it, but his brain would be able to learn that skill through a different highway than what you or I, who didn't have a brain bleed, would be able to have learned that skill through. So there are lots of things to be positive, and I'm very aware that things could have gone a lot worse for my son. But every time we have an appointment, there's always something. There's always something, and it just feels like we take one step forward to take 30 steps back. And so it's a real struggle. A lot of the days is a real struggle, and it's really hard to try and maintain that positivity when I think forward a lot. Like I said, I wanted to restart my social media to document this journey, because there are a lot of families out there with semi-similar journeys, but also families with completely different journeys, but still the same struggles. You know, you still have the same fears, you still have the same concerns, you still have the same pressure on your shoulders, where so much of your time is taken up by medical personnel and by appointments and physios and treatments, and the mental load of it is just something that I had never considered before. With all of that said and done, I would not change it for the world, because like I said, he is the happiest baby. He just completes our family. You know, he's, whatever that's going to look like, he does complete our family, and we love him. We love him, and we will do whatever we need to do to give him the best quality of life that we can. But that is the birth story. And so with all of that emotional offloading, that is his birth story. And so, like I said at the very beginning of this video, if you're still here, by the way, like you're a real one. But like I said at the beginning of this video, I am not sharing this story to scare you. If you recognize anything in this about your baby, so if you're concerned with your baby's developmental milestones, if they're not meeting them, if you're concerned and you have a owlet sock and it's registering that they're dropping oxygen, if you just, I don't know, if there's something about your baby that is concerning you, please don't take this video as gospel to go, oh, I recognize some of that in my baby, so my baby has the same thing as hers. Please don't do that. If you have concerns, or if you do recognize something, by all means take that information and go see your doctor and question them with it, and say that you see those similarities, and maybe it can help you to push for certain tests or things. But it's honestly, I am not saying any of this to scare parents. I am just sharing what our journey looked like, because I truly believe that if all of the stars didn't align And if the doctors at the children's hospital did not listen to me and my request for them to ignore the fact that he had rhinovirus at the time, and to take that one step further and to consider things outside of that box and to not get narrowed in, if they had not done that, if my original GP had not been on the ball and raised her concerns straight away and actually told me to go to the hospital, if my son had not even been wearing the owlet sock and it had picked up those oxygen drops and things like that, all of these things sort of came together to save my son's life. And if any one of those stages had not happened, it is very possible that we would have had a very different and very sad outcome at some stage. In fact, I'm almost convinced of it, that at some point I would have lost my son, whether it's through him having a apnea episode that he could not pull himself out of, so he just stops breathing, or whether he ended up having a seizure that was really severe and something horrible happened there and I didn't know what was happening because I didn't know that he had a brain bleed and that he was having this. Or it is possible that something could have happened within his brain where he had another brain bleed and we didn't know about it. Whereas obviously now we're so observant of him in such a way that anything suspicious, I have people I can contact and obviously an ambulance straight away. So just so many of those things had to align perfectly to save my son's life. And I'm so grateful, forever grateful, that every single one of those things happened when they did, as they did. So my son is still here. He is a very happy baby. You would not look at him and think he has all of these medical things happening. He just looks like a happy baby with some tubes on his face. And so, you know, it's just one of those things that I think sharing his story is really important, because had I not looked out for certain things, we could have missed it. And that's why I'm sharing it, because I think parents need to be aware of these things, and they especially need to know how important it is to push when your gut tells you something's wrong. Don't take no for an answer. Go to a different hospital, go to a different doctor. If you in your very gut feel like something is wrong, you are the voice for your child, so you have to keep fighting for them. And I am just so glad that I did, and I'm so supremely glad that his doctors listened to me and they did do some more investigating and they did dig a little deeper, because I don't think we would have found it otherwise. But yeah, so I think I have prattled on long enough. It's been a roller coaster the last 7 months. He's only 6 months old, but I count, you know, sort of the month or two before he was born. So sort of the last 8 months have been a real roller coaster, and lots of highs and lots of lows. And we're so grateful that he's here. But I am also just so sad that he has a lot of challenges that he looks like he's going to have to face, but we will face them with him every step of the way. And he has an absolutely incredible medical team from several areas that are willing to help out, and they just help so much. I'm really at a loss for words, because they are just so incredibly awesome. And they help me process things, and they make sure that I'm doing okay and that my family is doing okay and that we have resources that we need to reach out to and talk to process things and to ask questions and explain things and take the time to go through it. We're really lucky. So anyway, I think I have probably repeated myself several times by now, so I am going to end the video here. But if you do have any questions, or you want me to expand on something, or you want me to explain something a little bit more, please leave it in a comment below. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. And if you're interested, you can subscribe to my channel, where I'm trying to do sort of weekly vlogs of my mum life and what that entails, having a toddler and a medically complex baby. So if that interests you, feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.